Definitely, I know I need it. So, Father, thank you for this day. Just ask you to continue to help me and help us to get through this situation. Thank you for the provision through the AC being out, the audiovisual having issues, and yet through it all, getting us through that to have some time together to spend with you. We thank you for all the trials and tests that you give to us and that you orchestrate to help to learn and trust in you. Help me to get better at these situations, and just thank you for your provision to, again, sustain and resolve these things in your time and in your way. We thank you for each and every one that you have, as you have your hand in our lives, as you continue to guide and direct and teach us in your word. We look now into your scripture and continue to unfold the story to us of Noah, his family, the ark, and the events leading up to, during, and afterwards, and continue to show us your understanding of the truth that we can have applied to our lives and our hearts in these areas of Scripture from Genesis to see what it leads to in the future days. So, Father, we thank you again for the time we have together. May you be our pastor, our shepherd, our guide, our teacher, and our pastor. We ask all these things in Jesus, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so it's not hot yet. Thank God we have a lot of dark tint on the windows. But that one main door, it's not dark because you have to be able to see in. So it's about 78 degrees in here right now, but it is what it is. It's okay. It's not 87. That's good. Anyway. So today's lesson will be continuously on Noah's Ark. We're going to have to cut short because we started short, and I apologize for that with the AV problems. That was more the issue, not so much the audio, the AV problems, not the AC problems, but the AV problems. I can't even say that right. All right, so to do the review, what we're going to look at today is continue. We're going to look at chapter 9 of Genesis and the covenant that God made with Noah. But to go through, we actually jump from chapter 8 at the end onto chapter 9 at the beginning. So let's go and refresh and remind us where we've been at. So we discussed, we did like an overview of what's going into Noah's Ark and the kind of the scale, what was happening prior to and leading up to, involving the genealogy. We saw that there's a lot of date gap in the Shem line in chapter 11 that leads to a good 700 plus years in between what the King James would say and the Septuagint would say. That throws people's dates off of the flood, and it's interesting to note about that. That also feeds into why they say what they say about what the Exodus is. All the flood issue is really interesting because it ties into Shem's line, which ties into the dates of Exodus, ties into the dates of the kings. It ties into all these different things we don't even realize. But then we looked at also other things we didn't realize, namely me didn't realize. In Genesis chapter 4, there was a lineage of Cain that God put there for a reason. And I just always just read it and went, okay, on to the next. And then we see Cain had his firstborn son named Enoch. What a coincidence. That later on is the Enoch that came after Cain's son Enoch, came later on the Enoch that we know of that was taken up. Pleased God, and God took him. Interesting. And then we have a guy that after that, and Methuselah, his son, and then Lamech, his son. So we have Noah, grandfather and father, Methuselah, and Methuselah is the difference in Cain. Cain's son was Methuselah, and then on the Noah's grandfather was Methuselah. So they have the same prefix, Methus and Lach versus El, which is interesting. Then Lamech is the same name used of Noah's dad and the father of Naamah, which we pointed out is the woman who is the last one mentioned in the lineage with her brother Tubal-Cain. And then we mentioned that, and we mentioned how, okay, well, there's brass and copper being mentioned in Genesis 4, but yet historically that's not supposed to be there given the time frame of the flood. Which is why people put the flood at different dates, because they don't differentiate between mankind's history of archaeology versus the hybrid offspring. And so that's why they were extra intelligent human beings, and they were ahead of the course of humanity and their development of different things, as it should be, you would think. They're hybrid angelic beings, so they have a higher intelligence, so they're developing a much greater rate of pace. And I would therefore to say that their generations did not fade away into aging the same way the humans did. So the regular humans were aging, even though 950 years old was Noah, he didn't age and look the same when he was 700. He looked older than when Naamah was 700, okay, because she had a hybrid, right? So we looked at all that and saw some things there. And then we looked at Lamech's comment in chapter 4 of Genesis to remind you what Lamech said, which is one of the interesting things that you find here. One, Lamech marries two wives. He's the first polygamist. Then he's the first serial killer, if you will, because he kills more than one person. Cain just kills Abel. Lamech says in chapter 4 of Genesis that he kills in chapter 4, verse 23, I have slain a man to my wound and a young man. He killed 2 people. So he's the first one that had multiple murders on his ledger. He's the first polygamist and first multi-murderer. And on top of that, he's the first one mentioned in the entire line, from Adam and Eve through the flood. He's the only one mentioned who has him and a wife's name and a daughter's name in a lineage. No one else in Seth's line, no one else in Cain's line is mentioned to have mother, father, and daughter mentioned in the genealogy. That's an interesting factoid. Why would God do that? Unless Naamah had some significance. That's my conjecture based on the fact that God intentionally mentioned mother, father, daughter. Is the only genealogy he does that from Adam to Noah. Why would he do that? Unless he's pointing out a reference to us to pay attention, to which I didn't do for how long have I known God? 29 years. Pretty sad. And now I finally see it. Sorry. So Dad in heaven's going, really? Come on, son. Pay attention. So, and yet you have, I didn't see it. And then you have the fact that Naamah is a city in Canaan. We know that from Joshua 15, when the sons of Judah were given that inheritance. And Canaan and the land region, that's one of the 16 cities, one of them was Naamah. And we know that from Genesis chapter 15. So Joshua 15 and Genesis 15 are easy to remember. So in Genesis 15, the ites that came out of the Canaan line of the sons of Ham, Canaan being his youngest, from chapter 15 of Genesis in verses 18 to 21, God, Elohim, Chave, tells Abram, he says in verse 18, in the self-same day the Lord cut a covenant with Abraham, or a testament because there was bloodshed with the animals. And he said, unto the seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river Euphrates. And here's all the ites. The Kenites, and the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaims, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So all that land that belongs to those ites that were in the land of Canaan when they went in, that all came from Ham's line, mixed in, namely through Canaan, but there's other mixed in. You see, well, why do I say mixed in? If you remember, going back to Genesis chapter 10, from Ham's line, we saw already from Mizraim in chapter 10, verse 6, the sons of Ham was Cush, which came the Amorites, Mizraim, which came the Philistines, Put, we know nothing about, there's no reference of anything from him, and then Canaan, which came all the ites we just mentioned that were also in Canaan, which, by the way, would include, and I'll tell you about those people in just a moment. So the ites that would include the Nephilim, the Emims, the Anakims, and the Rephaim. And I got to take, this may be the AC guys, so I apologize. Let me just see. Hello?
Hi, is this Preston?
Yes.
Hi, Preston. This is Harold Warren with Crossman and Company.
Yes.
Hey, I actually just got your email, and just want to give you a call and say I've got an AC company on their way.
Thank you so much. No one, I mean, it's been like an hour. It's been a while. I just wanted someone to at least acknowledge, you know?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I know it's excuse. I was in church.
No, it's a good excuse. No, I don't know. I just thought that someone would have just a response, an automatic response, saying we'll get back to you. You know, I see it. We'll get back to you soon. If you're in church, I get it. I get that. That's what we're doing right now. so.
Well, I got David on his way, and I imagine he should be there in the next 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, I think it's an outside thing, just so you know. The outside unit's not turning the fan, so that might be the solenoid got blown, maybe. That's what happened in our house just last week, actually. So.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I just told him to do what we need to do.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, have a good day today.
Thanks, you too. Bye. All right, that's what that was. They're coming. Thank God. He was in church, so I'm like, well, I understand that, but I mean, wow. All right, that's what we're trying to do too. So, all right, so we see here in Genesis, in chapter, where was I at? I was trying to say to you right now. In Genesis, Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. So Mizraim is where the Philistines came from. So there's giants definitely through Mizraim's line. Through Canaan's line, we have also giants, because we know that from the fact that we have giants in the land of Canaan, and he said Canaanites clearly in Genesis 15, and we have the Rephaim, the Nephiim, the Enims, the Anakims. Those were all in that land as we saw them referenced later on, and so those all came from Canaan's line and a mixture of his other brothers' bloodlines. Yes?
Laney said repeat about Lamech and multiple murders.
So Lamech he was the first one to be a polygamist with 2 wives, and he's the first one to have 2 murders on his ledger. Genesis 4:23 says he killed two people, a man and a young man. And he also says sevenfold and 70 times. So he actually puts a number out there for 490 years, which is coincidentally the number that we find later on for Daniel's 70th week, the 490 years of God's judgment upon Israel. What a coincidence. That number, out of nowhere, just boom, gets brought up. And God doesn't say it, Lamech says it. The guy who's hybrid offspring, who's totally incarnately evil, and he comes from the line of Satan and Cain, and he says 490, as if to say, my line I know is in slavery to sin and captivity, but I'm going to be my darndest to make sure we don't get wiped off this planet. And my daughter will marry in to a line and keep our line alive. And he marries, well, I don't know if he's behind it, but maybe. But Naamah did marry into Ham's line, to Ham himself. Yes?
The lady said, okay, and Vicky said, going a little fast.
Okay,
Pam
sorry.
said, I think he killed Tubal-Cain, the young man.
Well, that may be the case, and that we know that brass and copper are instruments of judgment that speak to like Hades, Gehenna type things, and so you know that there was a lot of judgment and anger, and there's a lot of evil going on here. So, and God did say there was violence among all flesh, remember? God killed animal, man killed man, Cain, Abel, and then Lamech kills more than one man, and then we have animal killing, man killing animal, animals killing animals. So on the ark, it's a pretty interesting situation where you had meat eaters, man on man, and man on beast. So I wonder if Lamech actually was also cannibalistic, because remember, or was he just offering up his own kids as a precursor to what Israel would do later on? Because they did do that in human history. They didn't like us humans have a good history. Humans have a bad, disgusting history. Not we, but humans as a total have eaten each other, killed babies in the womb and out of the womb. We don't seem to care about, what ethics are, right? We just don't care. So if Lamech's already a guy boasting about his murderous ways, and he has two wives, could he have done even worse things that are not recorded? I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past the guy, that's for sure. He's boasting about being a multiple murderer and having two wives. And he even says the 490 years out of his mouth that, again, aligns to a later on disclosure we don't even know about until later, much later in the Kings of Israel, that later God says, oh, by the way, 490 years. Like, what is that all about? I mean, you hear about that much later in the Babylonian days, and this is way before that. It's almost like Satan was again being used, God was using him to put forth the evidence that the reason why Israel was held captive is because the captivity was intended for Satan and his line, and because the Hamites married into the Shemites, which led to being those who were Hebrews, then Israelites, then Jews. Hence, they now are tied into that captivity of sin, which is why that would also speak to why they went back to false gods all the time. I could see why they did that, because it's in their bloodline and mixed in. But anyway, we're going back to how Lamech was a name, again, given to this man who was the father of Naamah, who coincidentally was the same name given later on in the similar consecutive genealogies we see that Lamech was the father of Noah. Interesting. So the father of Noah, Lamech, different Lamech, and a Lamech, a father of Naamah. Interesting. But remember, they don't age the same. So Naamah, because she's half hybrid angelic, she's not going to age the same. She's just not. So again, when she's 700 years old, she's not going to look the same as Noah. I would argue she's about 200 years younger. And why do I say that? Because of the generations of gaps you see in the human side from Seth's line. They average about 100 years difference between when they start begetting the next person. I believe there was again different lineage of vitality of life on the angelic side because of that hybrid intelligence and celestial offspring. You had more vitality of life, and so you had different genealogies of different generations being born different than you did on the human side. So I just think there's two generations. In other words, I'm saying that for every 2 generations of humans equaled like 1 generation of the angelic offspring, the hybrid, because of the different infusion of that ilk.
You said she's 200 years younger than whom?
I'm saying she was the same. I'm saying at the same age, she looked 200 years younger. So at her age 700, she looked 500. So when she was 700 years old, she was likened unto Noah's 500 years old. So I'm saying she was 700 when Noah was. She was about 630 when Noah was 500, but she looked like she was like 430. So she looked younger than Noah, even though she was older than him. Is what I'm saying. And I think I can't prove this, but I think Ham was 70 years of age, because I think the 70 would make her then possible. I don't know, I'm just guessing all this. I'm guessing that Ham was about 70, she'd be 700, because again, I think that number that Lamech brought up out of nowhere is not just coincidence, 70 times 7 to 490. So that denomination issue is probably still in play, which coincidentally could have worked given Naamah's birth and where she was at in the genealogy, and given where Ham was at. There's no telling when they were married, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We don't know when they were married. We just know they were married before they got on the ark. So maybe Ham was married at 70 years of age, which would make sense to me. And that would therefore, to keep the alignment of the 490 variation, that would make her around 700, which would then, I start thinking, is that possible? Yeah, it is. It is possible. She could have been 700. Is it what happened? I don't know. But is it possible? Yes. It's a plausible explanation that she was 700 and he was 70. Can I prove that? Absolutely not. Can I prove that she married Ham? Absolutely not. I can't prove that, but I can give you circumstantial evidence that leads to the fact she had to. So I can't give you concrete direct evidence. I can give you concrete circumstantial evidence that says, how could she not have? She had to have, because there's no other way to explain the other evidence that comes afterwards. And we'll get into that again to review that. Yes?
Okay, we've got several comments here.
Sure.
First of all, Vicki said those 10 nations in Genesis 15:19 that are removed are descendants of who? Ham? And
Yes.
Tracy said, so all the hybrid offspring were wiped off the earth in the flood. Pam said, yeah, but there was a recessive gene. Is one or more of the wives? And Tracy said, why did God allow that, considering he wanted to wipe the evil off earth? Is because he said wickedness of man.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's what happened. So to your point, all of Ham's line, his line, Cush, Canaan, Mizraim, and Put, all bad dudes. They're all hybrid offspring. All of them have the gene pool in them of the hybrid angelic and human offspring. How? Because he married Naamah. And him and Naamah's gene pool, them two together, mother and father, Ham 100% human, Naamah half human, half angelic, they get together, all their offspring are hybrids. It's just that simple. Make sense? Just like Satan and Eve, Cain, that's how he came about, right? Once you have that union, then all the offspring are like that. That's why God had to wipe out Cain's line. So you say, well, then why did the flood want to do that? But yet God still allowed, because of the tare and wheat principle. Remember the typology. The typology of the tares and wheat in the future, in the millennial kingdom, is that those who are not Jewish will try to marry into the Jewish line as if to have an attempt to inherit the heavenlies. That's their only shot, because they know they got no chance otherwise. So they try to marry in, to take it by force, as Jesus talked about, kingdom of the heavens. And God says, wait till the end. I can't weed them out, or else I tear up the wheat with the tare. I can't do that, because they're married. They're one flesh. I'll wait till the end and do that, right? The harvest's going to come, right? Same as the tare and wheat principle in Naamah and Ham. They're one. So Lamech is probably behind it, maybe, or at least I would think had some kind of part to play in that, where I wouldn't, if I was to go back in time as a fly on the wall, he may have had this whole orgy of thoughts in his mind, because he was definitely not a principled human, half-breed. He probably told his daughter, whatever you can do, marry in the Seth's line. Whatever you got to do, we got to keep our lineage going. We've heard these rumors about God wanting to destroy, because Satan was knowing about this. So he heard the words going out. And that's what's also would explain why she married Ham after God gave the word about the flood. He didn't marry Ham at the early part. It was later on. They concocted probably a situation. Similar likened unto Samson going from the highlands down to the Philistine lowlands to go and meander with women and Philistines and do riddles and all this kind of garbage, shows of strength, and he falls for Delilah eventually. What a doofus. Because he shouldn't have been there to begin with. He shouldn't even have been there. So
She would have been a hybrid.
that's, well, yeah, she probably was a hybrid, I would imagine, that's right. And so here you have Ham being of Seth's line through Noah, and now he's going to a place he shouldn't be. How do I know that? Because how else did he marry Naamah? She wasn't going to him. Noah wouldn't allow that. Noah's not going to allow this Yahoo to come into his righteousness, God calls him. He wouldn't allow this into his home or his region where the kindred family dwelt together. He's not going to allow that, which means Ham had to leave and go to find her, which is likened unto later on Samson and Delilah, which is also likened unto many people we talked before about the Shem line through through Seth's line of Shem through Noah. You have the Shemite line marrying into the Hamite line constantly throughout Scripture, which is blurring the lines, paving the way for the Antichrist to claim the Muslim line and the Jewish line pedigree combined. Just like in Cain's line and Seth's line, that ran parallel to each other in genealogy, Genesis 4 and Genesis 5. Those generations were parallel to each other. The reason why there's less generations mentioned in Cain's line, again, I think speaks to they had one generation equal to 2 over here in the human generations. That's the reason why you have less, or around 2 roughly, because you only have 6. She was 6 from Cain. Noah was 8 from Seth. There's 2 generations missing. That's why I say that difference. So when you have that parallel, you also have parallels, again, where Esau married an Ishmaelite. You have Abram married his own sister. He also married got with an Egyptian offspring, Hagar. You have Solomon and his situation, many people. And then you have, David had a Hittite. And you had all kinds of ites being mixed in between. Joseph married an Egyptian.
Jared probably was a hybrid.
Probably. Who knows? I don't. But because those sons aren't mentioned. They're just, we call them earthy ones because they're not significant in any further mentioning later on. But it's just a lot of interesting things that happen through this process of Ham's line and Shem's line constantly doing this number, getting together. So the reason why God didn't take out Naamah is because she was married to Ham. And you can't separate the wheat and tares. So what's he do? But he said, if you approach and uncover, you're going to die. So what happened to Ham's line? All the ites died in the land of Canaan. He wasn't playing, was he? He'd wipe them all out. Then they're probably laughing. Satan's going, oh, I still got Mizraim's line, the Philistines. Where are they at today? They're gone. How about the Amorites? They're gone. How about the Moabites? They're gone. He took them all out, man. God said, I'm not playing with you. They're gone. So he took them out not through a flood, but through using Israel as his agent of destruction unto those giants in the land. It's interesting how God used them as his weapon of choice to take them out. One through a little kid, one through the whole armies, Jericho fall. All these different things is hilarious to me, how God's thinking, Satan, really you think as a flood, I promise not to do a flood anymore, you're off the hook? I can use many ways to wipe you out. I'm going to use these other humans to wipe out you, which is going to be hilarious. Because you look like you should definitely win this fight, and you're going to lose. Sorry, I'm back here first. I'll go, yes, sorry. Yes, babe.
Okay, first of all, Tracy said, seems counterproductive. Sorry, it's weird to me then to wipe out everyone and leave a seed of hybrid. Pam said it's a mirror image of the millennial kingdom. And Tracy said it's interesting that you saw this now because I asked you about this a long time ago.
You did?
Your answer was opposite.
Oh, was it? You see? That's how, because I'm ignorant. See, there you go.
And then she said, so now there is no more seed from the hybrid offspring.
No. They've been eliminated that we know of. I shouldn't say no. There's no more dominant seed. I'll put it that way. I'm not going to be certain to say there's no more seed at all. There may be vestige of that, yes. I think there's vestige of it, yes, like remnants of it. But the dominant traits of ethnicity groups, no. I think it's been so polluted, married out of, that it's so many tentacles away from the original Hamite line. In other words, the line used to be directly Hamite and then directly Shemite or directly Ham. So it was Ham's line alone or Ham and Shemite's line mixed. Now it's mixed in with Japheth's line and all kinds of stuff. So I do believe that seed still goes on and permeates. Yes, I do. But not through the original giants. That's why you don't see as many of them. That's why you do still see people in this world have these ridiculous heights. You're like, how'd you get so, this guy's how long? You have this book that you just gave me. I'm sure it's going to list people in there, archaeology-wise, that are huge. And that's because you don't see as many of them because the lines of them got more polluted with Japheth's line because of the fact that it started off with Ham's line, marrying into each other, and then Ham and Shem's line doing that for a long time, and then God killed those off. The majority of he killed off those groups of Amorites and Philistines and Moabites and Canaanites, all those people. Then they started. There was some vestige of people that married in Japheth's line, so you still see some giants, but not anywhere near the magnitude and the relevance of what you had back then, because they're no longer a people. They're kind of off. They're like one-offs of different variations of marriage line, if you make sense what I'm saying. Yes, sorry.
Pam said Hillary is one. And then she said, I think all of the witch doctors in the
And I don't know, and I don't know what that could be. I don't know what, Tracy, you're referring to when you mentioned earlier to me. I'm not sure if you're referring to Ham having a marriage to Naamah, or just if there was hybrids on the ark or something. I don't know what you mean. I don't know what I said, but it doesn't surprise me that I was wrong, because God knows that happens a lot. So I'm just a sinner saved by grace, right? But still a sinner. So I don't know what specifically you're referring to that I didn't get right, and now I'm changing it. But that's okay. That's good. If I'm changing, God's using me, and God's continuing to teach me, and I like that. Yes.
Okay, Joseph marries Asenath, who is a hybrid. And then, of course, there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. So, I'm sure the Israelites married into the Egyptians at some point, but when they became the slaves, I think that would have greatly discouraged them marrying into the Egyptian line.
Yeah,
And
you
of
would
course,
think.
the way the babies were being killed when Moses was born.
Well, you still had Solomon later on married. Remember, he built a house for Pharaoh's daughter. I mean, he's.
But I'm thinking probably when they left Egypt to go to the Promised Land, that the line was almost, well, to say pure, it was probably purer than it was when they went into the
But you
Promised
got,
Land.
but not exactly, because you go back to Exodus 12, I think it is, when he says, and they left with a mixed multitude.
Oh.
Egyptians left with them, and God even mentions, he says, when they come in to be proselytes to you, you circumcise them, you treat them as your own. So they were with them. They were still intermarrying. And now it's just the opposite. There was some with them when they left Exodus.
Boy.
Yes.
Tracy said was about offspring through Satan through Cain.
Oh, well, then, you see, you were right all along. That just goes to show that, you see, there's a lot of things I don't get right. No doubt about that.
She said it.
That I was wrong about. She mentioned a comment to me in the past. I don't remember myself, but I'm going to take. She remembers. That's all that matters. She remembered that the Satan, Cain, and line went on. That she said it lived on after the ark, and I said no, and I was wrong, because obviously I'm saying now that it did, because I know it did, and that's the thing. I used to think that a third of the angels fell post Noahic flood, and now it's the only explanation I could possibly get, even though I didn't have any evidence. It just made it's the only plausible way to explain giants in the land.
Because there's only 2 falls in the Bible.
There's only 2, right. I just assumed there was a third one God didn't mention. He veiled it to us. But lo and behold, here I was not thinking about the tare and wheat principle, which does make sense to me. It's just like saying God starts his kingdom, and he just got finished doing, he just did Jehoshaphat, Gog and Magog number 2, and all the evil's been dealt with. So why allow these Yahoo tares to marry into wheat and let them proliferate and continue on for 1,000 years, no less? You just started a clean slate and restored the earth. Why would you want these yahoos to live for 1,000 years and then deal with it? Deal with it now. What's it? You just purged the place, and you're allowing these yahoos. But it's no different than the ark. And then God doesn't do things out of nowhere. He's a similitude to what he did in the Noah's Ark issue. Naaman married into Ham, and that's what I never saw. I never saw it. Mainly because, 1, I didn't consider the tare and wheat principle. 2, I didn't consider Cain's line at all. This is my ignorance. I wasn't even considering Cain's line and how it was parallel to Seth's line. I never even thought of it. And then Nancy brought up a good point about how you have Abel, coincidentally, Cain, and then you had Seth. Oh, but wait a minute. You have Noah's 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And you're like, whoa, you're like Japheth being the oldest aligns to Abel, Shem aligns to Seth, and then Cain aligns to Ham. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that is like so true. Because Ham and Cain are both hybrid. They both participated in, Cain was a hybrid. Ham brought forth hybrids through Naamah. Japheth being the oldest, that was Abel. There's no mention of Abel's offspring because he didn't have any. And the Book of Chronicles, no mention of him there.
There's no mention of Japheth in Job or even in all these ites.
No mention.
Going into the Holy
Yeah,
Land.
whereas Seth and Shem have the line that's most dealt with,
Yeah.
which is most interesting. So there is an alignment there. I thought it was very interesting you pointed that out. So it's very, very good insight. So there's a lot that I didn't, bless you, there's a lot that I didn't see before, and it's namely because, again, I didn't understand how I knew Noah couldn't have married a Yahoo. There's no way, because God would not consider him righteous if he did that. So I never considered his sons. And then when I considered his sons, if I would have just had my brain opened up to the genealogy of Cain, I'd have been like, oh, I don't know, I just didn't think about it. I didn't know. And now it kind of makes sense. And I didn't realize that Naamah was the name of a city in Canaan. I didn't realize that Solomon married a woman from the line of the Hamites who's an Amorite queen. And I'm like, whoa, all this different stuff. And he had Rehoboam from that. So it's just kind of interesting. God just at the right time. Took him 29 years to get to my thick skull, but hey, I learned. So,
now, why in Genesis 9 does it still say twice Ham is the father of Canaan?
Because it's referring to the fact that he was already born. And he was already born. He was the one about to do, because number 2 is the number for witness and testimony. They're testifying that all the kids had all their kids. All Noah's kids had his grandkids. They were born at that time. And here's Canaan, the youngest. By naming him, he's saying all the litter is out there. All these grandkids were there. And he was the one who did what he did. He's pointing him out as 2 reasons. 1, witness and testimony, that all of Noah's grandkids were already in place after 20 years off the ark. They were already born, all of them. And then he's also, because they were fruitful and multiplying. All of them were born. And he's saying of all of them born, Canaan was the youngest. And he's pointing that out to let you know he's the one who did the evil. Of all those that were born, it was him. Not Shem's kids, not Japheth's kids, and not all of Ham's kids, just this one. And what a coincidence, it's from that one who would then occupy the land from which later on God would annihilate them all and have the promised land for the Jews.
Well, and he would have to have been almost like 16 years old to have done what he did to his grandmother. So it almost sounds like all the grandkids came in the first 4 years.
They did, yep. They had a lot of, they were doing what God said to do, fruitful and multiplying. They were doing a lot of that.
But then for the next 16, it's like
He was a
it
youngin'.
wasn't.
He was a I know, exactly.
I wonder why that was.
I don't know.
I mean, Canaan being the youngest and being, say, 16 when he did that to his
Yeah.
grandmother.
Which is definitely when, you're at a peak of all that, sexual promiscuity in life, that's for sure, as that mid-teenage years. Yes, sorry, back here.
Ham said yes, but to your credit, you discovered that it was actually Ham's son that violated Noah's wife.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't know, I thought it was Ham my whole life. I didn't know it was.
Jim just joined.
Who did?
Jim?
Okay, I thought it was Ham, then I thought it was Canaan, then I went back to Ham. So I've gone back and forth on the who,
Well,
but I never knew the
Egyptians
why.
weren't everyone's servant, and they were progeny of Ham.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that
Yeah.
tells you right there.
Yep, that's right. And he's a servant of servants, he said, because of the fact that, again, all their line would be, he was the worst of all of them being cursed because of Cush's line and of the Mizraite line and Put line. His line, I would argue, is the one that God singled out totally to annihilate the land of where Israel was. He didn't address the Philistines till later. He didn't address the Amorites till later, and the Moabites till way later. Those all came later. Canaan's line got killed off first. Clearly. And so that was the curse of Cain. He was the servant of all the servants, of all the kids that Ham had. He was the one who had to come into him first and with the heaviest hand. And that's what happened to him because of what he did. Yes?
And Laney said was quite a few years after the ark that Canaan did that.
Okay, let's go. Yep, it's 20 years. Because remember, God said in Genesis in chapter 4, or chapter 6, excuse me, chapter 6 and verse 3, he said, my spirit wouldn't strive with man for 120 years. We know they were on the ark for, 100 years later is when they got off the ark, right? And then they are starting to have the covenant we're going to go into here. How you doing there?
Excuse me, hear about your air?
Yeah, it's the outside unit. It's not blowing. The fan's not moving at all.
It's blowing in here?
No, it's not blowing at all. The fan back outside is not moving at all.
I know, but do you have the air on?
Yes, it's on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on. Yep.
Thank you.
So when you have the folks in I forget. Okay, Genesis chapter 9, they get off the ark, and then chapter 8, and now they're 100 years on the ark. God's 120 years, wouldn't strive with man, because 20 years after that is when the incident happened. That's what God was talking about. So God actually foretold Noah about. I mean, if I'm Noah, I'm thinking, why is it 120 years for? 100 years goes by, and God says, get on the ark. If I'm Noah, and he's righteous, I'm sure he must have realized this. He must have said, wait a second. You said 120, and I'm on the ark at 100, so, interesting. Are you, because he was 500 when God called him. He was 600 on the ark. You can't differentiate that, no matter how you slice it, as 100 years. So then you go, okay, where's that 20 years from? Noah should have known 20 years after the ark disembarkment, or I should say 1 year after that, so 19 years after they got off the ark, something's going to happen. And sure enough, something did, which is why I think also twofold. He knew what he did, but he also probably remembered what God said, and he knew what God said, and therefore he's like, you're the curse. Because he knew there was something that's going to make God say, I wouldn't strive with man no more. What was it? He just found out. This is what it was. And that's why he saw what Canaan did, but he also knew what that curse was, or that consequence, what God was talking about with his spirit not striving. It's almost like when Ezekiel saw God's glory. That was devastating.
And 20 is the resh for wicked.
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Okay, Laney said Shem was 100 years old when
Yeah, so they were all triplets that we know about. Shem, Ham, and Japheth were all triplets that we know of, because when it says he continued he became 500 years old, he begat. It didn't say that after 500 years old, it said he became. In other words, Noah was 499 when they were impregnated into his wife. He was 500 years old when they were born, because the word's a moving verb, hayah. Genesis chapter 5 and verse 30, what is it? Is it verse 31 and 32? 32, I should say. In verse 32 in Genesis chapter 5, 32, Noah was 499 years old, because he was hayah 500, which means he was not 500. He became 500. So he was 499 when they were impregnated into the womb, and then he begat them, and then his wife gave birth to them when he was 500. Again, showing why their age was different on the ark as well, as we know about. So they were actually 99 years old, if you remember, when they were on the ark. They turned 100 when they were on the ark, if you remember. Noah was 599 and turned 600, if you remember, on the ark. Remember? And that's why they're saying 2 years later, because talking about, I did that timeline before. Shem, Japheth, and Ham were all 99 on the ark, and then turned 100 when they were on the ark, when they were waiting for that 7 days. And then you had Noah they turned 99 and he turned 600. And then they're on the ark for a year, so he disembarks. He's now 601. They disembark. They're 100 years old. But they've been 2 years on the ark, 2 years because of the calendar we talked about in previous study. Yes?
Laney said that is really a great thing to see that Noah's kids were not listed in the begatting list.
No, yeah, they're just like boom, boom, boom. You know what I'm saying? So I think they're triplets. It's just the first, by the way, the first sign we see in Scripture anywhere of triplets. The first sign, which is ironic, 3 came from 1. Another typology that Noah was the first one that God chose to call righteous from Ezekiel 14:14. And he's also the first one God used from out of 1 came 3. What interesting thing of that. He's like a type of God himself, who was the one who, I don't know, God the Father, he's the Father, Noah. God the Father was the one who gave us the kafar and kefer, the outward and inward pitch of the atonement for our sins, through the person and blood of God the Son, Jesus, Yeshua. Just like Noah pitched the ark. The boat is also a pre-type of Ark of the Covenant, because within it was God's righteous commandments, God's staff, and with no Aaron's staff, and then you have the bread. And inside the ark was God's substance. God's commandment was into Noah, what he had to do. And of course, you had his rod that budded, represented Noah's leadership. All that was inside that ark in the person of Noah and God's provision to him, just like it then spoke to the provision of who Christ is. And so it's not coincidence, all that stuff aligns. And so I think that's why, again, I don't think they were born at different times. They were all born at the same time. There's nothing that tells us differently that they were not. Yes, sorry.
Even though they weren't triplets, we're only told of 3 sons of Adam, Cain, Abel, and Seth.
Yeah, they weren't
So
triplets.
I know
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
triplets, but we're only told of
3,
3 sons
right.
of Adam.
Yeah. You
They've
had,
had more, but we're only told 3.
yeah, Cain and Abel were different fathers, but they were born same time, because they were conceived within 2 weeks to 3 weeks, 4 weeks max of each other. Yes?
First of all, Laney said, what does your version say about Shem in chapter 11:10 about Shem, the age? Think I need to listen to last week again. Pam said Shem was 100 when he had his firstborn, type of Abram.
Correct.
And Todd said Shem was 100 and began.
He was 100. Archishad.
Yeah, 2
He-
years after the flood.
He-
Laney said, yes, I have an okay version.
He was 100 years old because he turned 100 being 1 year on the ark. But because they got on the ark, when they got on it, they went through a cycle of 1 year and 2 years. They were on the ark for 1 year, but the calendar of the Jewish people starting in Nisan, the flood was in May. They went through a whole year on the ark. He turned 100. Remember? He turned 100 he was on the ark for a second year. He didn't say he wasn't on the ark for 2 years. He just said he was 100 years old 2 years after the ark. Because he's talking about the year. 2 years had passed because of the fact that he was on the ark when he was 99. And then you have the ark we did that study before, and I mentioned that to you on the calendar piece of it, and it speaks to him being 2 years afterwards. Yes?
Lady said, thought I was confused, likely got it.
Is that what it is?
Problems in here.
Oh, is it really?
It's not calling for it to come on.
Really? Oh, okay. All right. So then you look at, so when you look at going back to that aspect of what you're talking about in Genesis. So then you go back to chapter 10 of Genesis and the lines of Ham in verse 6. Ham, his sons are Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. And it says, and the sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, Sabetcha, and the sons of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. And the word, he became a mighty one in the earth, and he was a mighty hunter. It's the same word giant used in chapter 6 when you go back and you look, and he says, and there were, verse 4, giants in the earth in those days, and they became mighty men. This is that same phrasing in Genesis 6:4 that we see for the first time used, now being used of Nimrod. What? Nimrod's a giant, mighty man? Say what? So how did that happen? If you just erase the earth off the, so it wasn't like shortly thereafter. It wasn't like, we're talking Ham had Cush, and then boom, the hybrid line. Like what is mentioned? It's like, wow. So you don't see, and by the way, Canaan himself had to be of hybrid line because it says Canaanites in the land in which they were then to expel those giants and have their promised land. So Genesis 6:4, you want to align that over with Genesis 10 and verse 8 and 9, speaking of Nimrod being a mighty one mentioned 3 times. In verse 8, mighty one on the earth. Verse 9, a mighty hunter. And before the Lord, Chave, he is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter, before the Lord. 3 times it mentions it. Because you know why? He represents the unholy union, the unholy trinity, if you will. He was the guy. He was a precursor of what the Antichrist is going to do. Heck, have a one-world government, have a one-world economy, have a one-world belief system. Hey, we can do this. Let's go take it on. He was a precursor to that. And that's why he mentions him 3 times, as the unholy trinity, if you will, the mockery of God in the person of Satan's line, Nimrod, which is just interesting to me. So he was the father of rebellion. It's that simple, which later on became, as we saw in Genesis, or excuse me, in the book of John, Jesus said that Satan was a murderer from the beginning, and yet the first murder we see in the Bible is Cain killing Abel. So God associates Cain's murder of Abel with Satan himself, just like here. It's not Nimrod doing this, it's Satan in Nimrod doing this rebellion. Yes?
Vicky said, oh my gosh, that answers why Genesis 6:4 says, and afterward. Pam said, yes, Vicky.
Yep. And you saw, that's correct. And you saw what Vicky just mentioned, and those days, and after that, when the sons of God. So you had these situations, and how Naamah had to be the one who got with married to him, because how else do you get this? Nimrod's the first factoid you can see. You go, wait, whoa. That's just one generation later. That's Ham had a kid, and that kid had a definitive person described as a giant in the land that God just got finished saying is the reason he brought a flood. One of the many reasons. That is one reason, and the violence among all flesh. So what? What is that all about? How did that happen, right? Did the angels really, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, I never saw it before. Did the angels fall that quickly? As a 3rd time not mentioned? No, come on. No way. The other option, then all of a sudden I started realizing, wait a minute, there had to be a lineage somewhere that people all were saying it was Noah, and I'm like, no, can't, because they accuse him of getting drunk. No. Then you go right away to, and you see it's because of Ham's wife had to be. It wasn't Shem's wife, it wasn't Japheth's wife. It was Ham's wife because it was what Canaan did. And the phrase younger son is what the real key was. There is no word for grandson in the Hebrew scriptures. And we saw from the book of Kings where David says his sons, and it lists Solomon and Rehoboam and all these people. That weren't David's sons. It's his lineage of sons from those words I gave you from the word son that we have. Yes?
And Vicky said, never understood that clearly.
Yeah, so now the word younger son doesn't mean Ham. It means of the line of sons of Noah, which would mean his grandson, his great-grandson, and all that. So the youngest one of all of Noah's kids, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, of all their kids, the youngest of all the grandkids was Canaan. He was the youngest one, and that's why he's called the younger son.
Yeah, Noah, the 10th generation, Nimrod would be the 13th.
Yeah, it's crazy, and it's pretty sad. Yeah, 13. Unlucky 13. That's pretty. Yes.
And Vicky said, why does Genesis 10:9 say that Nimrod was a mighty one before the Lord? It says that 2 times. Pam said, I think that means in God's face.
Yeah,
It
it does. At the actual in the exegesis, if you look it up, before it has the Greek transliteration of like in the face of, in the presence of. In other words, in the face of God, he was a mighty one. He was trying to assert himself, just like we hear about with the anointed cherub that covereth. I will ascend to the north, and I will be as the Most High. This is the same kind of attitude that Nimrod had. Yes.
And Pam said rebellion.
Yep. So because the phrasing should say it this way in Genesis 10:9. He was a mighty hunter at the face of Kaveh. That's what it should say. Because he was actually, he was combative, he was confrontative. He wasn't, in God's eyes, God wasn't giving him an accolade. He was stating his attitude and demeanor of his mind and heart and spirit. So,
He said, okay.
so going back to, I hope that answers all these questions you were having, a lot of good questions. And so you got to just go through and continue to understand that typology as well of wheat and tares as to why would God let this happen. You mentioned the comment, I forget who said it, but it's counterproductive. Well, the wheat and tares together itself, if you understand what it means, unhumanized, it all sounds counterproductive. That sounds ignorant. Why would God, the foolish virgin makes no sense. Why would you let somebody enter heaven only to go, well, you're an idiot, and then you kick him out? You know what I mean? That doesn't make any sense, right? So why get him that far just to boot him out? Why let a tear in? Let him coexist and actually procreate for 1,000 years, no less, and then deal with the issue. Hey, I didn't write the book, man. I know, I get it. Why bind Satan in the abyss? Only to let him out again at the end of 1,000 years. There's a lot of things I could say sound counterproductive. I get you. I get it. But I don't question what God does. There's always reasons for those things, and this is nothing different. So God did it for a reason, to show that, again, a flood, he destroyed it earlier, the same issue, that later on he's going to do it with a new weaponized aspect of the people he's going to call out. I bet you Satan didn't see that coming. God created Hebrew language out of nothing. Creates the Hebraic people out of nothing. Out of Abram, an idol worshiper. And all of a sudden they started to get mighty and mighty and mighty. And I bet you the first sign that Satan saw was, he's like, whoa, Abram just took out these kings of the plain when he rescued his nephew Lot. Took them out like they were nothing. Like they heard Abram, one guy's coming against 4 kings. They're like, and he just wipes them out like they're nothing. You're like, what? And that's when Melchizedek then, of course, encounters Abram after that. Interesting enough, I bet you that's where Satan first went, wait a second. Something's with this guy that he called. If the one guy could do that, later on, God made a mighty people out of those, out of that gene pool, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel, 12 tribes, and all of a sudden they annihilated all the Canaanites and all their ites in the promised land. Boy, was that a precursor to that. So you can just see how God just crescendoed this sense of, Satan, you can laugh and jeer all you want, think you got the last laugh. It's not counterproductive. You think it is. Wait till I continue to unfold my justice on this earth in my way, in my timeline, for his own reasons. Because he also used it, by the way, to buffet Israel. Interesting enough, he used it to buffet them constantly. He said that about the Amorites and the Moabites. He used them to buffet them, just like he did the giants. To question their faith, to doubt their faith, to cling to him and trust him alone. And they didn't do that constantly. Yes?
Asenath, Rahab, Ruth, Hamites are folded into the line of Christ.
Yeah, that's right. Asenath, if you didn't hear.
The hybrids are folded into the line of Christ.
Asenath,
Oh.
Rahab, Ruth, that's right. They're in the line of Christ, yeah. That's right, and that's how the Antichrist is going to act like he has a right to the throne, because he's going to say, I'm in.
Mercy in this somewhere.
I know, and it's crazy, isn't it? I know. There's mercy in all this. There's God's love in all of this. But so go back to Genesis chapter 8 and 9. So when Noah gets off the ark, we talked before about him killing these animals, one of the clean species. So imagine if you're the animals, and you're of like the 30,000 animals, and you're seeing about, say, 2,000, 3,000 being killed. I got to think, if I'm an animal, land or flying creature, I'm going, did y'all see them? He's just like a machine for 2 weeks. Just, it isn't like he's taking a break to get something to eat and party time and relax. He's taking breaks to refresh and do his daily necessities, but other than that, he's pretty much a machine at offering these sacrifices. So if you're a creature watching that, you're a land creature, you're a bird, for 2 weeks, we talked about this probability of taking the account of like 2,000, 3,000 animals, and you're taking about 5 minutes per sacrifice minimum. You're talking 2 weeks, right? So you're like, okay. So if you're an animal, a land creature, or flyer of the air, you're probably either scared out of your mind or extremely angry, all right? One of the two is true. Like we say today, fight or flight, right? Either you're scared to leave because you just saw what this guy just did to all your kindred folk, or you're so upset that he might do that to you, you want to come after him. What's the next thing God says, chapter 9? Oh, and by the way, and Elohim blessed Noah in chapter 9 of Genesis. Elohim blessed Noah and his sons and said to him, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, and fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every living beast of the earth, and of every flyer of the air, and upon all that moves on the earth, and upon all the fish of the sea. Even the fish of the sea were like probably thinking, oh great, us too? We're subject to this too. They weren't the ones being killed. It was the land and air creatures. And yet now he makes it clear, because the animals, I think, had some retaliation of sinful nature coming out, and God just put the fear in them. Because you can imagine, not only did they see this carnage, literally, of carcasses lined up for 2,000. There's a lot of animals, man. And you're going to come after this guy. And because now the sin's back in play, we saw that 20 years later. And God goes, nope, not even going to happen. He makes the fear of man inside every animal. And so Noah and his family, only 8 of them against 30,000. They're like, he's like, thank God you did that, God. That wouldn't have turned out well. Yeah.
So Ham is among the sons that got blessed, and he got blessed, I guess, after Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan.
Yeah.
After all of that.
He got blessed. He got blessed. God blessed them right here before they had any kids, though. This is where he had any kids. God, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, blesses them. There was no children yet. They just got off the ark, and God blesses all of them.
But of course, he was already hooked up with Naaman.
Correct. And that's why, but that God also, he also blesses the wheat tied in with a tare. We see that. He blessed Samson, even though he was mixed in with a tare. He blessed Solomon. He blessed his people, even though we make ignorant choices. Blessed David, and he blesses a lot of people that intermingle they're not supposed to. He won't bless their spouse per se, but he'll bless you. So interesting. But that's why some people say this is why Noah did not curse Ham, because he couldn't curse what God blesses, which is true. You can't do that. Because in the Barak Balaam story, you found that out the hard way. So Noah knew you can't curse what God blesses. Even though Ham did sin, people say, why didn't God curse Ham? Because he's not allowed to. Because Noah's not ignorant. He saw God just blessed him and his sons. He can't curse what God just blessed. You can't do that. Yes?
First of all, Pam said accountability, exactly what the churches don't teach. Vicki said Palestinians today use that to prove they should be in the land and not Israel.
Yeah. They're ignorant.
And I think probably because Ham was blessed would mean that he could not have done that awful deed to his mother.
Yeah, I mean, he was still cursed with his sin, but he was protected from acting on it. But his problem was twofold. One, what was he doing in his father's tent, which speaks to his habit of going places he shouldn't be, which I think, again, conjecture time, I think that based on that factoid, that he went where Naaman was. Because again, 2 reasons why I think that. One, Noah would never allow the kindred at those times who dwelt together, he would never allow a Yahoo into that camp. They're not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So, especially not into marriage. That ain't going to happen. So he's not going to let that even proliferate that. So it had to be something later on he had to accept because they were already consummated. He's like, oh, great. Now I got to take this in because now I can't undo what you've already done. It's one flesh now. So he knew that. So I think that's one reason. No one would not have allowed it, so he had to go to her, not other way around. Ham went to Naaman, not Naaman to Ham. And secondly, how do I explain here where Noah didn't go to Ham? Ham went into Noah's tent. What you doing in your father's tent? What you doing? That's not your business. What are you doing in there? That makes no sense. And again, then you find Leviticus 20 we talked about before, where it says you shouldn't approach or uncover. And the word approach, we saw before that he looked intently, continuously. It didn't just, people say, oh, no, Ham just raw. He just raw, R-A-A-H, Hebrew word for look. No. It's written in an ongoing tense. So he looked intently. He continued to take it in. He was basically viewing a situation, which is why later on it says he went out and told ongoing his brothers. It's a verb that means an ongoing tense. So don't just look at the word, look at the tense it's in. The tense it was in said he ongoingly told a story, which means he had a lot to tell because he had a lot he saw. It wasn't just a 2-second or 1 minute. He was viewing this and talking about whatever he saw to Shem and Japheth. And they went in backwards, kind of knelt down, is what it means. They knelt down and they put it over their whole mom's body and said she was good. And that's what happened. And so here you have in Genesis 9, before we get to that point, God said in verse 3, every moving thing that lives will be meat for you, and as green herb I have given to you all things, but only flesh with the life thereof. Interesting here where he says, every moving thing that lives shall be meat for you. This is where I, in past times, Genesis 9:3, would use this to say, oh, that means they were vegetarians before the Exodus from the ark. But that's not true when you go back and you compare Genesis 6 when God told us that there was violence on the earth among all flesh. So they were all killing each other. Man was killing man, animal was killing animal, man was killing animal. You can't avoid, I was so ignorant to that truth. So it says that multiple times in Genesis 6 to remind you, if you go back, he says there was violence in the land amongst all flesh. He says that in verse 12, and he says that in verse 13. You all good?
Yeah, I gotta suck out the drain line, that's
Oh,
the problem.
okay.
And the flow switch, I got
Okay.
it just dangling right now, so
Okay.
the air's on.
Thank you, man.
But, I'll have to come back in and close it up.
No problem, no problem. Thank you. All right, so the reality is that he says in Genesis 6 verses basically 11 through 13 that there's violence. He says in verse 11 and verse 12 he says they corrupted their way. He says again there's another corruption away to all the earth. So you have violence in verse 13. So you see that this is a problem, again, man on man, animal on animal, and human on animal. So they were eating human animal flesh before as an offshoot of that truth. You don't kill an animal and just not eat it. Of course you would. You want some food. So the reality is that you see later on here in Genesis 9:3, well then why would God say, people say, well why would he say then that of every thing there's meat for you that lives, and even as green herb have I given you to eat, as if to say, now you can eat flesh. Because on the ark they weren't allowed to. That's why he said that in Genesis 9:3. Never dawned on me. That would make sense. He asked, God gave instructions on the ark. Here's the grain, remember that? Remember, go back to Genesis in chapter 6, last verse, and last two verses. And take unto thee of all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it should be for food for you and for them. And Noah did all that, Genesis 6:21. So now they're off the ark. God just gave them instructions. You eat only grains and veggies, you and the animals. So as far as Noah's concerned, another evidence why planting a vineyard was a bad thing. Shouldn't have done that. Should have been building cities. And so here you have all of a sudden, boom, he gets off the ark, and God's got to tell him, okay, that truth I told you before, it's now changed. Now you can eat them. And he's like, oh, really? He goes, yeah, like I did before? Yeah. Okay, good. So he goes out, and then he makes the animals afraid, and so on. So then he goes in verse 4, and because of this is why in verse 4, because of that truth, they're going to be hunted again. The reason why I put this principle out there about animals being accountable is because before there was violence amongst all flesh, human on human, man and human, animal on animal, and man and animal. So in verse 4 he says, only the flesh thereof, which is blood thereof, you shall not eat. In other words, this is why I, myself, don't like eating raw meat, or if I cut into a steak, I don't like seeing the blood come out myself. I take that seriously. To me, God says there's life in the blood. I don't like seeing something cooked rare myself. That's me. So that's why I don't do it rare myself. I take that to be like, I don't think that's good. So that's just me. So I'm not saying I'm legalistic. If you do it, I'm going to judge you. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying for me, I take that to be a good principle to live by, so I'm not going to do it. So then in verse 5, he says, and surely the blood of your lives, this is Genesis 9, verse 5, the blood of your lives, your soul, your nephesh, I will require at the hand of every beast, I'll require it. And at the hand of man, and at the hand of every other man's brother, will I require the life of man who shed man's blood. So he says, again, I'll require it at the hand of a beast, I'll require it at the hand of man, and at the hand of every man's brother. What? Every man's brother. In other words, if you're a party to it, if you're the one who did it, or if an animal did it, you're all accountable to me. If you were a part of it, if you did it, or if an animal did it, you took a life of a human, you answer to me. Wow. God's not playing around, right? He tells that straightforward. So why would God have to say that for? He said, well, were they killing each other? Lamech sure did. And this is another evidence, by the way. Think about something. Were they killing each other among Seth's line? No. There's no mention of that. They obviously were doing bad things to each other. They were sinning and there was violence against each other, probably fightings, but were there murderers? I don't know. It's not mentioned. But where it is mentioned is among Lamech's line. And who's in Lamech's line? Naamah. Who's now Naamah's husband? Ham. Who are Ham's kids about to be? The bad dudes. So you probably wonder why he says this, as if to say, Ham, I'm talking about your kids. Okay? Well, I don't have any kids. The ones you're going to have. Okay? They're going to answer to me. And I bet you, if I'm Ham, looking back, I'm going, yikes, he was talking about my lineage. All of us are in play, but directly to his line. and indirectly to the other Shemites and Japhites. Yes?
First of all, Pam said, I think that refers to cannibalism. Vicky said, if the animal is dead, then the blood isn't a problem. And Pam said, right.
Right. So, and he says in verse 6, whoever sheds a man's blood, by a man shall his blood be shed, for the image of God made he man. So this is where people say animals don't have souls. Well, sure they do. God called them every chai nefesh. He said that multiple times, Genesis 6 and 7, and we saw this again here. He calls them chai nefesh. That's us and them. So we have this. So here we have God making a covenant here. He begins to make a covenant now, coming up on verse 7. But first he puts forth some ground rules. By the way, this is where the Freemasonry people get some of their pretext of understanding. They get it from Genesis chapter 9. They believe that Noahic law plus Solomon's structure of the temple is the pretext or foundation of their Freemasonry belief. I don't know if you know that or not, and that's why they hold themselves better than Christianity and better than Judaism, because they go, in their minds, they take the best of Judaism, Solomon's wisdom, and they take the precursor of Judaism, Noahic law, and together they say that makes us better than Jews and Christians. And so they had this one brotherhood of believers that believes, that's why they call God the great architect of the universe. That's why they call him that. Because they say through Solomon he built a temple. Before that he helped Noah build an ark. And those are their two icons. Both guys God used to build something from once to dwell and previously to deliver. So they think, those guys are two. So they built their entire structure of belief on those two dudes. And since Noah wasn't of Jewish belief system or Christian belief system, this is the reason why they invite all one God belief people into their temples. They invite Muslim, they invite Jehovah's Witness, they invite Christian, and call us all the same. They say you're all the same. They have a Quran on their altar, and they have a Bible on their altar, and they have the Torah on the altar, and they say it's all the same. No, it's not. They say it's all the same. And the reason they get that idea is from Noah, who was not Jewish, nor Muslim, nor Christian, right? He was none of that stuff. And they would argue the law of God's rules of premise came through Noah, of how to live one's life on the very premise of respect another person and his property. That's the premise of our UCC codes in our country, for example. That's the very, if you whittle it down, it means that. Respect another and his or her property. And that's kind of what he's saying here. So in essence here, in verse 7, he goes on and he says, and you, because he said you kill a man and you're going to have his bloodshed. So you kill a man, I'm going to kill you. God says, take his life. So people say, well, they make fun of Christianity. Oh, you don't believe in abortion, but you believe in a death penalty. Well, because the baby didn't take a person's life. That's why. There's two different things. Hey.
Feels better already.
I know, man. Thank you. You're the man. So the reality is that if a baby's not taking a person's life, but if a man takes a man's life, that's why death penalty, we believe in that, whereas abortion, we don't. People joke and go, oh, it's a matter of timing. No, idiot. It's a matter of acknowledgeable action. The baby has no choice and has no options of which they can do or not do. They're in total enabled state. They have to be enabled along the way to even have life through us and God interacting together to keep him alive or her alive. The man who's on his own accord takes a life, that's different. That's 100% accountable and responsible to that human. And God says in that situation, that's why death penalties incur. But you don't laugh and jeer. You don't do that. You take it as it is. You still respect the life that God made, but they got to come under this consequence. Yes?
I was reading the book on the Ten Commandments. I think it's kind of about Laura Schlesinger, and she wrote it with a rabbi co-author. And they go into the thou shalt not kill commandment, and they say character assassination is in the.
Oh, character assassination. Yeah.
Wow. And
Yep.
one of the worst things
Thank
you
you.
can do is publicly humiliate someone.
There you go. It's not cool. Yes, babe. Yeah, babe. Babe?
See, did I read this one? He said if the animal is dead, then the life.
Yeah,
blood
you read
is the
that.
problem.
Yep,
Okay.
yep.
And then Lainey said intent of the heart is wicked.
Okay. And so when he says he requires our life from another man taking it or an animal, it's interesting. And so here you have people say, well, how can God require our life of an animal? This is another evidence, in my opinion, that animals could talk. Because how's that conversation going to go? How does that accountability work anyways? So if a gorilla or a lion or a hippo or whatever, elephant, kills a human being intentionally, you're going to, what does God mean when he says in verse 5, surely the blood of your lives I require at the hand of every beast? How do you require it? which is the word we use, the words account, require, an accounting. How's a lion given accounting? Like the Ghost in the Darkness true story show of the two lions in Africa who killed humans and dragged their skeletons back to a den. They don't do that, by the way. People think those lions to this day, they're like in the Smithsonian as being, they think are demon lions. They were possessed by demons. Because lions, that's not their habit. They kill their prey, eat it where it's at. They don't take it back to a den. They don't do that. But this lion's den in Africa, during this English occupation of Africa, they were actually, during the Boer Wars, they actually took the human carcasses and were stacking them up in a den, like there was hundreds of them. It's a true story. You can read about it. You can just movie about it. It's a good movie. And it's unbelievable. So people say, well, those are lions that are definitely, that's evil. You don't do that. Possessed or not possessed. God didn't say, if they're possessed, they're off the hook. It didn't say that. Every beast. That's why Judas wasn't off the hook. Even he was possessed by Satan. He's still accountable. He put himself in that position. So here, how's that reckoning or that requiring, that accounting, how's that happen? Does the animal not talk? I mean, I think they talk. I mean, did they go, I mean, come on. I think God's showing you from the Garden of Eden, as they were in the day, they were able to, the snake was more cunning. That means more crafty. That means he was more able to communicate, because they were already communicating. And that's why Eve never said, oh, wow, the snake's talking. That was already commonplace to talk to animals. Quite an interesting thing, right? So it wasn't like she was surprised by how he talked. He was like more, crafty. He was more crafty. Not that he was crafty. He was more crafty, more subtle. He was more a good orator than other animals. So I think here is another evidence that animals could communicate. Now, maybe they're not by verbal skill. Maybe it's by telepathy, whatever. But the point is they could communicate in some way. I don't know how you're supposed to make someone accountable if they can't communicate. How's that going to work? If you can't communicate in some way, how can you be made accountable for something? It's just interesting to me. It's just, I don't see that could be possible from God's hand. Anyway.
Remember Balaam's ass talked.
I know, exactly. When a donkey talked, that's right. And that's why I used to joke and say, if people think that women shouldn't teach a man, be careful, because God used an ass to teach a man. So, just saying. So, I'm just saying. People always say, women can't teach a man. Really? But a donkey can. Okay, that makes sense. No, it doesn't. So in verse 7, and you be ye fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply therein. And he says, and you see that? And you. He's talking to, again, Noah and his kids, because that's who he's addressing from verse 1 of chapter 9. And you, right? So then he says, and God spake unto Noah and to his sons. He says it again here, to his sons in verse 8, saying, I behold, this is the first time he mentions the covenant, and he purposely readdresses Noah and his sons. Again, another reason why Noah didn't curse Ham. Not only did God say, I bless you, but then God restates who he's talking to say, not the animals, you and your sons, I'm making a covenant. And then Noah's getting this in his head like, okay, I got it. Even though I know my son married a Yahoo, you're saying you're making a covenant with him. You already blessed him. Now you're making a covenant with me and Ham and Shem and Japheth. Got it. Thank you, Lord. He didn't say, and your wives. He said, and with you and to his sons, saying, and behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed. And this means your progeny, which means hybrid or not, he's not going to flood the earth again. You're like, you can imagine Satan going, I got my wish, my tearing wheat thing. That's what God said in the millennial kingdom. At the end, he's going to tear out the iniquitous people in Matthew 13. At the end, he's going to take out of his kingdom. Remember, to remind you, bears to witness, to remind you in Matthew 13. Go to Matthew 13 just for a moment to remind you. People always ignore that piece. In Matthew 13, verse 41, at the parable of the wheat and the tares. And verse 40, as therefore the darnel is gathered and the burn in a fire, so will it be at the end of the age. Matthew 13, 40, verse 41, the Son of Man will send forth his messengers who will gather out of his kingdom all seducers and iniquitous persons and will throw them into the furnace of fire. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth, because that's day 8, which is aligned with what that says, which is also what's happening here. God saying between now and the day of execution, I'm not going to flood the earth again, but you'll let me see the bow in the sky. I'll remember it. That's not so. It's for you to know, but it's for me to always look at it and go, I want you to know every time you see it, I'm seeing it, and I'm remembering what I said to you.
All of the many vessels, some for honor, some for dishonor.
That's right. Some for honor, some for dishonor, some for wood. That's right. And so here he says, I'm with you and your seed after you, which is, again, Ham's line, Shem's line, Japheth's line are all off the hook with this flood happening again. He's about to tell you what the covenant is. So the covenant is just saying who it's with. Noah, his sons, and their entire progeny. But he also says, and with every living creature or soul that is with you. And he defines. People say, that just means the other humans coming out of their gene pool. No, 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 no. And he defines, of the flyers of the cattle, of every living beast of the earth that's with you, from all that go out of the ark to all living things of the earth. It says every living beast. It should say all chai, which means plant life. And that's why it says the trees of the field clap their hands, because they know God made a covenant with every living thing. In addition to those that were on the ark, God says first, Noah and his sons. Then he says all the animals on the ark, land and flyers. Then he says, and all living things on the earth, which is grass, herbs, trees, bushes, vegetables, fruits, all that stuff. They know if I'm alive, God, I'm not going to see a flood no more of a worldwide existence. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. So God made it for everybody in that order. Noah and his sons, then the land creatures and the birds of the air, and then every living herb and living thing, he says. Everything has chi in it, life in it, which is the plant life. Then he goes on, he just tells you who he's making the covenant with. Then in verse 11, he tells you a little bit more about the covenant. He's progressively teaching us about this covenant principle, how he unveils it. He continues to define the same covenant, but he says it a second time. Genesis chapter 9, verse 11. And I will establish or raise this covenant. Same thing in verse 9, raise the covenant. Establish, raise it up. In other words, out of nowhere, he's the one making this. He's the one building this. Raising meaning he's the one who builds it. He's the one who establishes it. He's the founder of it, and he's the creator of it. It's the basis of him, and he's the one who makes the rules of it. It's on the basis of what he says and how he says it. And he says, I establish my covenant with thee, and he says, with you, neither, in verse 11, neither shall all flesh, now he's talking about, again, all flesh, that's animal life, human life, everything, all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there be any of a flood to destroy the earth. Why would he say that last part? Because he wants to make sure that the plant life and the herb life also know what I said earlier, I meant it. I'm not just saying that humans and animals of flesh won't be destroyed by a flood, but nothing of the earth, again, will be worldwide flood. No more plant, no more none of that stuff.
But
So
there's fire coming at the end.
Fire, yeah, but not a flood. Yeah, that's right. So he says that. So he reestablishes how the flood's not going to touch, not going to kill flesh, or any more be a flood to destroy the earth, which is anything on it, right? That's what he's emphasizing. The Kai. No more life will be worldwide eliminated like he did already. Verse 12, which again, if you're Satan hearing this, you're going, yes, I got my wish. It's almost like Satan, he's giving you a pretext of what happens in the millennial reign when they say, you can imagine the same thing right there that God just said aligns with Matthew 13. You can imagine when Satan hears these words, he's going, yes. And verse 13, when they say, let's see here, when they say to the Lord, let me see here, and he said, now let's stand weeding. He replied unto me, the servants, verse 27 of Matthew 13, the servants of the household were coming, said to Master, did you sow good seed in your field, whence there is darnel? He replied, an enemy man has done this. Verse 28, Matthew 13. And they said to him, dost thou wish that we should weed them out? He said, no, lest in weeding out the darnel you also tear up the wheat. Let both, verse 30, grow together till the harvest and the time of the harvest. And I will say to the reapers, first gather the darnel and bind it in bundles for burning, and then bring them together in the wheat, and bring together the wheat into my granary. You can see Satan going, yes, my little plan is working perfectly. He's in the abyss, but he's going, you know what? My little consequence I put in play, it's going to come to fruition. I can have my little minions at the end. I'm going to call from those order of minions to come with me to one last coup. He knows what he's doing. He's a jerk. Does it resonate with you a little bit when he's going, God just made a promise in verse 11 of chapter 9 of Genesis, no more flooding. So I can do this again, this whole procreation and giant thing, and we'll just come again against God's people. And we'll do it again. And they tried that in Canaan. It didn't work out well for them. It did work with 10 of the 12 spies, though. They were scared out of their mind. Satan was so good at his little planning. It made 10 of the 12 spies go, shit, we can't do this. They're too big, they're too great, there are too many of them. We're little grasshoppers. And God goes, that's because of that. You're 40 years of wandering. That's what's going on. Yes?
Craig and Sandy said we need to leave now. Happy Father's Day.
Sorry about that, Father's Day. My apologies. So then you go.
If they weren't there, there wouldn't be tests for Shem.
That's right, there wouldn't be tests. So you go further on, there are tests for Shem and Japheth. So in verse 12, the third time God mentions the covenant, we're going to crescendo with these covenants and get through this, I hope. Verse 12, and God said this is the sign, a token, a sign, which is a sign out ahead, it points to a future of the covenant. So it's a sign that points to a future. Now he's talking about who the covenant's with, what the scale is going to be of all living things. And he says in verse 12, it's pointing to ahead. Ahead of what? He says, I will make between me and you and every living creature that is with you. Now he's telling you what the covenant points to. He tells you who it's with, the scale of it. Then he tells you it's pointing to something. For perpetual generations, I will set my bow in the cloud, and this shall be the sign of the covenant between me and watch, and the earth. But God doesn't care about animals, you say. Animals have no soul, people say. Really? First he requires the life of a man by their hand, by their claw, whatever. And now he's going to make a covenant with them. And now he's going to make another covenant with them. Really? Come on, man. Why does God make a covenant with something that has no soul, has no life, has no chai in it? Makes no sense. They have a chai and a nefesh. Yes?
Vicky said if taking out the darnel tears out the wheat too, how do they gather first the darnel? Are they both taken and then separated? And then she said Matthew 13:30. Then she said, never mind, it's a rabbit trail.
No,
And Lainey said the shovel.
It's just a memory issue of remembering back to what we said. It's been a long time we visited the darnel and tare. If you remember, the agricultural harvesting process is you would gather the wheat together on the threshing floor, and you would take the fork and you would throw it in the air, and the chaff would fall away, and the darnel you separate. So it's in the harvesting process. They're harvested together, and then through the winnowing fork, which is what John the Baptist said, remember? He who comes after me, I'm still not fit to carry. And with this winnowing fork, right, he winnows out. And then at the very end, then you shovel out the things that your fork can't pick up because it has those teeth. It can't pick up the small grains, and you shovel out. So there's the winnowing fork, that chaff falls away, wheat's heavier, it falls down. Then the darnel is separated from the wheat, and you actually shovel out the rest of that. So it's all together, and through a process of winnowing and the shoveling, that's how the darnel, the chaff and the darnel and the wheat is separated. Yes?
Lainey said in the 1,000 years, not shovel, yes, fork. And Vicky said, okay, that is what I thought, but wondered if it had changed somewhat.
No, so the winnowing fork is the beginning of their millennial reign. The winnowing fork is the beginning, and the chaff blows away. That's why the Nepios and Brephos, who have heard about the kingdom but don't get to enter, they're the chaff, they're out. At the end of the millennial reign is when the shoveling process takes place and the harvest takes place. And that's when you see the wheat separated, but then you have to harvest it into the granary. And to harvest it into the granary, you have to actually separate it. He's not going to separate the wheat from the chaff. The wheat from the darnel, excuse me, till the end of the millennial reign. So the wheat and the chaff are separated at the beginning when the winnowing fork is used. But then at the end, the shovel is used to separate the wheat from the darnel. Because darnel and wheat look the same, and they're both heavy, whereas chaff is light and it blows away. So the winnowing fork makes the chaff blow away. Nepios, Brephos, and Nepios of Sperma, they're gone. And then during the millennial reign, at the end of the harvesting, then they separate the wheat from the chaff at that harvest time from being harvested to the threshing floor where the chaff separation took place. Then they're harvested again into the granary, the wheat is, and then you're separating the wheat from the chaff to distinguish what wheat goes in the granary. Because remember, it's in the storehouse. First, you bring the harvest to the storehouse to separate the chaff. That's a temporary place. Then you go to the granary, if you remember, which is the permanent place, if you remember that. This is old teaching I've done it a long time. But the storehouse is a temporary place. You first gather in the harvest. You gather the harvest in at the storehouse. Then you harvest it into the granary later on. So when you first gather into the storehouse, you separate the chaff from the wheat, but the darnel still looking like the wheat, so you don't distinguish it just yet. And then as you're putting wheat into the granary, now you're taking the permanency of now using that shoveling process, and you're separating the two together. And that's when the darnel dealt with at the end of the millennial reign. That helps to remind you of that. So we've talked about it before, but it's been a long time. Very long time. What a surprise. We talk about so much stuff, it's hard to remember, right? It speaks to how I've gotten things wrong in the past, right? So anyway, so back to Genesis chapter 9, hope that helps, Vicki. Wasn't a rabbit trail too much, see, it wasn't too bad. So I got to finish up these covenants, hopefully, before we get to a chance to leave out for the day.
Thank you, and Lainey said fading memory.
That's okay. No, that's fine. I mean, Tracy already called me out today, so that's truth too, right? So in verse 13, he said, I do give my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant, and between me and the earth. So again, it's between me and the covenant, not just between God and Noah and his sons. Then he says, and the creatures. Then he says, all plant life. Now he says the whole entire earth, the whole planet. It's amazing, right? So he's continuing to progress. He's saying, Noah and your sons, land creatures and flyers, plant life, and now he says the earth in total. Even the land itself, even the dirt. Like, really? It's amazing. He says, and the earth. Verse 14. Because see how God's expanding the covenant, what it means? He tells you who it's with, the scale of how it's, what the flood's going to not do again. Then he tells you with the sign of a bow in the sky. Then he says, verse 14, it shall come to pass that when I bring an overcloud over the earth, which is interesting because you have to have the rays of the sun, which are light is actually white, but it hits the prism of the rain droplets, and you see the same 7 colors in a rainbow. And I forget the order. I wrote it down myself. Let me see. I'll tell you the order. It's always in the same order, and sometimes it's reversed because it's refracting back through another rain droplet, but it's the same order, sometimes reversed. And that is, if I can remember, I wrote it here. It's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. It's the same 7 colors, always. And again, interesting enough, you have those same 7 colors that only come out of the fact that they're being refracted through the water of the rain droplets back until you see a bow. So for those people who I laugh and say they think the earth is flat right now, I think it's hilarious because the bow is a bow. It's a bow and it's a bend. In other words, trying to find the end of a rainbow, like leprechauns say, pot of gold, is like trying to chase the head of your shadow. You're not Peter Pan and you can't catch it. Just so you know, you can't catch your shadow. This isn't Peter Pan's fictitious Disney World story. You cannot catch the end of a rainbow. That's insanity because the vantage point will constantly be different. And it's hilarious to me. People say, look, I got a rainbow in my backyard with sprinklers. Oh my gosh. That's like saying, I'm in a planetarium. Look, I can touch the stars. Are you ignorant? The scale of that are the same thing. Are you kidding me right now? You're taking a small scale of something that is unscalable to a level that you can't duplicate. It's like saying, I got a full image tattoo of myself on my body. What? Yes.
Okay, the mic, check your mic, and then Tracy has a comment.
The battery went dead. That's okay then. That's just the battery. Okay, I'm here.
So Tracy said Roy G. Biv, B-I-V, an acronym for the rainbow colors.
Oh, yeah. Roy G. Biv.
Name for Roy G. Biv.
Roy G. Biv, yeah, I've heard that. That's Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, indigo, violet. Is that right? Red, orange, yellow, green, indigo. No, I'm missing one.
Biv, B-I-V.
Oh, blue. Hello. Ha! Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Roy G. Biv. Thank you. So yeah, so that's the covenant there God makes. And so the sun is actually a white light, and then when it hits the refraction of the water is what causes those colors, which is what I also think was the case with Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat, that it was actually white and iridescent, but when the sun hit it, it was what caused it to look so colorful. And so it was an earmark that he was pure from God as the sign of the sons that Jacob had, and that's why they didn't like him. It wasn't just because Daddy liked him, it's because God favored him as well, and they knew that. God favored him through Daddy, and they didn't like either one of those things. So anyway, so when you go back to Genesis in chapter 9, again, we're closing out from today's lesson, but he says there's the bow in the cloud. And again, if the earth was flat, then you could actually show me on a camera you finding the end of a rainbow. And until you can show me that, then I stand corrected that you are a laughably ignorant person to think you can get to the end of a rainbow. There's no such thing. You can never get to the end of it, because there is no end of it, by the way. It's actually a circle. You just can't see the end of it because of the earth's shape. You see it as a cut-off arch. But God said it's a bow. It's a bow. It's a bow. And so you see it as a bow, but it's a complete round. And sometimes they have images from airlines. You can actually see it as such out of the window of a plane at certain altitudes. So if you're fortunate enough to see something like that. And yes, there's moon bows, but the moon gets its light from the sun, so hence it's the same thing. The colors are a little different, but it's the same thing. Yes, I'm aware. Okay, so it says, now it shall come to pass, and to bring a cloud over the earth, the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And watch this, in verse 15. So the first time the covenant's mentioned, it's who it's with. The second time, the scale of what the flood won't destroy. The third time, it's pointing to the sign. The fourth time, he tells that the sign is for all the earth. The fifth time, he says, I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living nephesh of all flesh. Again, another evidence that animals have souls. You must be out your mind. You can't read verse 15? Every living soul, nephesh, of all flesh, he says. And the waters shall no more, again, be a flood to destroy all flesh. And he says in verse 16, so verse 15 is the first time he said, this isn't just for you to know. I want you to know that when I see the bow, I too remember this. Wow, that's pretty awesome, man. So God's saying to us, this is for you, for you, for you, for you, for you, for you humans, for you animals, for you plant life, for the whole earth. I'll make a sign. And so you'll know. But by the way, when I see it, I remember everything I just told you. Wow. You imagine that? Every time there's a rainbow in the sky, God's remembering this chapter of Genesis. That's pretty awesome, man. Pretty awesome thing for God to say. Thank you so much, Lord. He's remembering everything he just said. Which is between me and you, he says, and every living creature, every living soul of all the earth, of all flesh. And the water shall be no more. Another interesting reason why you don't just read the King James. You got to read the Hebraic scripts that talk about the word nephesh and soul. In verse 16, he said, it never will destroy, in verse 15, by a flood all flesh. In verse 16, and the bow shall be in the cloud. And I will look upon it and see it. So verse 16, he repeats it. Not only will he remember it when he sees it, he'll look upon it and he'll see it. And he'll remember, not just what he said, but it's an everlasting, eternal covenant between Elohim and every living soul of all flesh that upon the earth. Again, evidence again, I keep telling people, how can you say animals don't matter to God when he tells you he's making a covenant with them? And he's telling you he's remembering them when he sees the rainbow. Come on, man. What is wrong with your head? Why do you hate animals so much that you can't see God's love for them, God's provision for them, God's promise to them? So you can say what you want, but that's...
Well, it says a righteous man regards the life of his beast.
Well, there you go. Righteous man regards the life of his beast. What scripture is that? It's a proverb, right?
Yeah,
obviously.
it's a proverb somewhere. Yeah.
So I don't remember. I love that. So in verse 16, and the bow shall be in the cloud. I will look upon it, and I will remember the everlasting covenant between Elohim and every living nephesh of all flesh that is upon the earth. And Elohim said unto Noah for the seventh time, this is the token of the covenant, which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. All flesh. So again, Noah, his sons, and all the beasts. He ends where he started. Then he says this in verse 18. And the sons of Ham went forth, or the sons of Noah, Ham, excuse me. The sons of Noah went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. And these are the sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth, it says, overspread. It means they were dispersed and scattered, which goes back to later on in chapter 10, when the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. He's telling you from every ethnicity came out of these three guys. They're the ones every ethnicity came from, or some variation therein. He's telling you there's no variation of ethnicity. It didn't come from these three guys. Get your head examined if you think otherwise. There was nobody else. It's just them. They're the ones who made every human being that we see today. So for all of us to say, there's only one kind of Homo sapien, then you go and you see another different kind of human and different manifestation of pigmentation and culture, you're going to be shocked, because we're all humans. They come from different variations of those three human beings. Ham, Japheth, and Shem. We're all one of those, or a combination therein. Yes?
Vicky said, why did God say this 7 times?
Again, that's my statement too, is that God makes it 7 times to make a declarative statement. God's complete number. He has completely reserved his judgment of earth No longer by water, but by fire. Because 7 is his complete number. And at the end of day 7, 7 covenants, times he mentions, he's going to destroy the earth by fire. He renovates it at the beginning of the millennial reign, but he destroys and makes it new by fire, which is interesting. At the end of day 7, at the end of a 7-day, day 7, 7,000.
When it says he won't destroy the earth again by water, it doesn't mean he won't destroy the earth again.
Again, he just means by
There'll be
water.
another means.
Yeah, he'll destroy the earth, just not by the means of water. Correct. He's talking about the means. Yeah, he's emphasizing the completion of, he's completely done with that means of water, and he's completely culminating the fact that his judgment's been reserved upon all the earth and through that means until later. So he's going to reconvene this judgment of earth, but never by water. It'll be by fire, as we know. That's why I think the number 7, his completion of judgment at this time of the whole earth won't happen again until later. And when it does happen, it won't be by the means of water. So it's a double test. It's a testimony of both things. He's
Isn't it
reserved.
interesting, the darkness, the water, and the fire are present with us. The angels of the first estate punished with darkness. Then in Noah's water, and then at the end fire. And the
Yeah.
darkness, water, and fire are with us every day.
That's true. Water, darkness, and fire. It's true. Water, darkness, and fire. And so then you mentioned earlier about in verse 20 is when it says, and Noah began to be a husbandman. Began to be. It's a moving. It means that he wasn't. Now he was. So he began to be. This is where the 20-year gap comes in. If you're wondering where 20 years fit in, it's right here. So it says in verse 18, and then went forth to the ark, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What's it say? And Ham is the father of Canaan. And it says in verse 19, and these are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth dispersed. He's telling you they all had their children. They all had their children. They all had their children. And it says, and Noah began, in verse 20, 20 years had gone by. Or I should say 19 years, because they're on the ark for 1 year. And then 19 years later, Noah then plants this vineyard. And then it says again, Ham, the father of Canaan, because he's pointing out, again, of all the generations that are born of Noah's grandkids, it's the youngest grandkid, Canaan. Of all the sons, you had all their sons, he's pointing out there was a multitude of probabilities. He wants it to be known. It was Canaan. Why? Because Canaan is the one later on that would manifest themselves as the chief adversary against Israel. The Canaanites and all the otherites who proliferated through the land of the promised land that God would exile and kill. And so that's why he wants to point that out. And that's why Noah does not curse Ham, because he's blessed and made a covenant with. 2 things you can't, come on. You can't curse Ham. Even though Ham did do wrong on 1, being where he shouldn't be, which is a precursor to what he was doing with Naamah, being where he shouldn't be, to even have courting with her. Secondly, he was approaching. It says, don't approach the nakedness of your father. He saw and looked and ongoingly took it in. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Well, he didn't do anything. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And he went outside and told the story. He did do nothing when he saw his son do what he did. It's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. You don't see evil and not act on it. You don't let your son stand uncorrected when he's doing rebellious, iniquitous things against God. That's bad parenting. You cannot allow your son to be rebellious and iniquitous against God and go, yeah, whatever. And go tell you, do it in real life, see what happens. Have your own son do something iniquitous and rebellious against God. Have your own son or daughter rebel, and when they're younger, and your accountability, right, 20 and under, they do something iniquitous and rebellious against God, and you do nothing. You watch it happen and just take it in. You're taking notes like, wow, it's an Oprah Winfrey show. You're like, interesting. Like you're watching a movie or reading a book going, this is interesting. What? Taking mental notes. Then you go out and tell your brothers, when in fact you did nothing. You think that sanctions that you're exempt because you weren't cursed, you're okay? No. The only reason you're not cursed is because you were blessed by God and made a covenant by God. That's the only reason you're not cursed. But the consequences of your sin, they're heavy and hard, my friend. That's why all your offspring are cursed. Not just Canaan's offspring. That's why he says he's the servant of servants. All your line is bad news. All your line is servants. He's just the chief one. And so Cain's going, all my kids? Yes. That's why I said servant of the servants. I'm not playing with you. You did nothing right. I'm not going to curse you, but you know darn well what you did was wrong. It's what you didn't do, the sin of omission. You didn't act. You didn't correct. You didn't discipline. You didn't chastise. You didn't train up a child in the way he should go. You didn't correct them. What is wrong with you? Well, he did nothing wrong. Yes, you did. He didn't do anything. You can't sit back and do nothing and say, I'm a godly father. No, you're not. No, you're not. On Father's Day, do not do what Ham did. Do not let iniquity and rebelliousness, when they're under 20, go unaddressed. You have to address it. And the way God wants you to, the way God leads you to, that's fine. That's between you and God. But you got to do something. You can't do nothing. It's not an option. Not an option.
Think about
Not an option.
movies and TV show you all kinds of portrayals of injustice, and you do nothing about, you're watching it, you do nothing about that. I think it inures you to, in reality, when you see injustice and stuff, not to do anything about it.
Yep, it's true, because TV shows and movies enact you to not do anything. And by the way, I'll end with this, get the question. So Ham, on Father's Day, did the trifecta. Dishonored his father in heaven, dishonored his father, and as a father didn't measure up to the responsibilities of the office. He failed on all three fronts. Dishonored God the Father, who gave him a blessing and a covenant. Dishonored his own father by approaching him and disgracing him and being in his tent to begin with. And then didn't report the incident and correct the incident as a father should do, didn't act in the office of his position and responsibilities. He failed in three ways. And that's why his consequence is great amongst all his children. Even though Canaan was the one cursed, and Canaan was the one who was servant of servants. He's the worst of them all. Yes?
Okay, first of all, Pam said 7 equals 7,000 years
Yep.
type, and day age renewal.
Yep.
Vicky said, do you think the 7 colors of the rainbow correspond to all the different living things that were on the earth before the flood? Plants, herbs, animals, birds, creepy things, fish, humans. I wonder what color we are assigned to. I may be reading into things here.
Well, I think the 7 colors myself is a reminder that God set his covenant 7 times.